Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1074th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege to be your MC today for a conversation featuring Dr. Fabienne Eggelhöfer, Dr. Max Rosenberg, and Dr. Pepe Karmel. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Fabienne Eggelhöfer has been Chief Curator and Head of Division Collections, Exhibitions, and Research at the Zentrum Paul Klee since 2017 and a member of the Executive Board since 2022. She has curated numerous shows at the Zentrum Paul Klee and abroad, such as at the Fundación Juan March in Madrid, Pushkin Museum in Moscow, Centro Cultural Banco do Brasil, and Centro Cultural Moneda in Santiago de Chile, and published various essays and exhibition catalogues on Paul Klee and global modern art. In 2012, she completed a research project on Paul Klee's teaching at the Bauhaus, leading to a Ph.D. degree. Max Rosenberg is an art historian and director of research and exhibitions at David Zwirner. He has a Ph.D. in art history from Yale University, and he has received grants and awards from the Daedalus Foundation, the Fulbright Program, the German Academic Exchange Service, and the Getty Research Institute, among others. He has published articles and reviews in Art in America, Textur zur Kunst, and the Getty Research Journal, and he is the editor of Deanne Arbus's documents. And our host today, Pepe Karmel, is a professor in the Department of Art History at New York University. He is the author of Picasso and the Invention of Cubism, Abstract Art, A Global History, and Looking at Picasso. He has written widely on modern and contemporary art for museum catalogs, as well as for the New York Times, Art in America, and of course, the Brooklyn Rail. He has also curated or co-curated numerous exhibitions, including Robert Morris Felt Works, Jackson Pollock, and Dialogues with Picasso. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Pepe to get us started.
Thank you, Chloe. It's really a pleasure to be here somewhere in cyberspace with all of you today. And the occasion for our talk today is this exhibition at David Zwirner, Paul Klee, Psychic Improvisation. So let me just start with a few words background that are probably totally superfluous for this audience, but as you know, Paul Klee is one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. His work had a huge influence on artists around the world, particularly in the decades after World War II. He was constantly exhibited in New York in the 1950s and 60s, but he seems to be less well known to American viewers today. So David Zwirner Gallery has helped to change that situation with a series of recent Klee exhibitions, beginning with 1939, late Klee in 2019 and 2020, and now continuing with Paul Klee, Psychic Improvisation. It's, as you can see from the photograph on screen, it's a very spare, elegant exhibition. We're going to try to come back to talking about the exhibition design. It highlights a series of stunning, little-known works from throughout Klee's career. And today, I have the good fortune to be talking with two Klee experts who you've just heard about, Fabienne Eggelhöfer and Max Rosenberg. So let's dive right in. Chloe, if we could go to the next slide, please. So the imagery of Klee's very early work, like this 1903 etching of a virgin in a tree, recalls the Swiss symbolist Giovanni Segantini. It's figurative in style with a strong evocation of three-dimensional form. So my opening question for Fabienne is, how did Klee get from here, from a work like this etching, to the liberated, quasi-abstract, colorful style of Cemetery, which you see on the right and which is in the exhibition at Zwirner?
Well, as you can figure out, that was a very long journey for Klee to get from the Virgin in a Tree to Cemetery. So Virgin in a Tree is an etching Klee made in 1903. That was the time when he had abandoned his studies in Munich, and he went back to Bern, Switzerland, where he had grown up. So he said, I haven't learned anything at the art academy. It's too traditional, and I can't learn anything that helps me to develop my own artistic language. So he went back to Bern and he started a couple of years of self-studies. He also went to anatomic drawing classes with the students of medicine at the university in Bern. And then he went back to Munich. I just tried to keep it short. He went back to Munich, where he, after having married his wife, Lili, who was from Munich. And there he got to know Vasily Kandinsky, Franz Marc. So there he started to get in touch with the whole avant-garde art scene, which was very important to him. And in 1912, he traveled to Paris, where he saw the first Cubist artworks. And so he started to get into this more abstract art with the help of, seeing other artists who were searching for the same as he was searching for.
Yeah, and I would just like quickly jump into Fabienne, kind of just thinking about the stylistic transformations that he's going through in this kind of interim between the two. It's like early on in 1903 with these etchings, right? You see the kind of influence of Art Nouveau and Jugendstil, and some of the teachers that he did work with in Munich. And right, it's still about like shading of form and that there's also something kind of ironic or satirical in it too. Absolutely. Right? The distortion of the human body, which that continues throughout his, there are these through lines that continue throughout his career, and that kind of caricaturist treatment sometimes of the human form continues, even though in a very, very different way.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. This satire and caricature, that's something that you can find in his work from this early etching till he died, yeah.
So one of the key moments in this transformation, as I understand it, Chloe, if we could go to the next slide, please. I know I'm dating myself as an old-fashioned art historian by referring to slides instead of screens or whatever, but is in 1912, Klee goes to Paris and he meets Robert Delaunay. And I'm wondering, Fabienne and Max, if you could talk a bit about how did this meeting come to happen? What effect did it have? It seems to be a key turning point.
Yeah, I can jump in. So I believe, and I'll probably say this many times throughout the conversation, so Fabienne, correct me if I'm wrong about these things, but it was actually Kandinsky who had suggested to Klee that he meet with Delaunay on his Paris journey. And Klee had seen Delaunay's works in some of the first Blue Rider exhibitions, that Kandinsky had organized, and had been organized in 1911 in Munich. So Klee was familiar with his work from that, and then was told he should visit him in his studio. And so during this Paris trip that he takes in 1912, he goes to the studio, and what's kind of interesting, at least as far as I understand it, is in his diary, he kept an extensive diary throughout this time. He doesn't write at length about the studio visit. He notes that he visited Delaunay's studio, but doesn't exclaim that it was this revelatory experience or anything like that. But it clearly was, as this kind of comparison shows. And just to mention that the work on the right, Cemetery, is in the exhibition at Werner right now. So you clearly see the influence kind of coming to bear on that, even though I think they're doing very different things in some ways.
Yeah, I think it was Franz Marc who told him to go and see Delaunay, but but it shows very well how important it is to have this network, which is even nowadays for artists very important, and which was really for Klee very crucial at that time. So yeah, he was not really writing about this studio visit, but they stayed in touch. So we have letters that they were exchanging, and Robert Delaunay sent a text to Paul Klee, La Lumière, about the light, and asked Klee to translate it in German, and then it was published in Der Sturm, which was an avant-garde art magazine at that time. But Klee's translation is very free, I would say. It was more a Klee interpretation of Delaunay's text, but it shows already how important it was, this idea to think about how important is light also for the colors. And what is also interesting, that Sonia Delaunay, obviously she was also there at that time, and she writes afterwards that at that time she got the prints of the Trans-Siberian poem that she was illustrating for Blaise Cendrars, which was a Swiss writer who was living in Paris at that time. And she says, it's interesting because afterwards Klee was doing something that is very similar to what my illustration did in this for this poem. And that's what we can see afterwards in 1913, 1914. Klee was really experimenting how he could transform what he has seen in Delaunay's atelier studio for himself.
And right, and it was kind of a little later in the 19-teens when he incorporates this type of Orphist language, right, Fabienne? Like it wasn't that immediately after 1912 he started working in this style. It actually took a few years. In some ways, it's, you know, what's often written about or viewed, and it's kind of in Klee scholarship, this, you know, epic moment when he travels to Tunisia in 1914, and that he proclaims to be his really the revelation of color for him. You know, while he's traveling in Tunisia, he's writing in his diary and you know, exclaiming like, "Color possesses me." And he returns from that, and then kind of a few years after that is when you kind of start to see this imagery, this style of imagery and this style of formal composition emerge in his work.
Yeah, but I think this trip to Paris in 1912 was as important as the trip to Tunisia. It was just Klee was not writing about it.
Right.
You know, he was even editing his diary, writing to his wife, maybe sometime it will be published. So he was aware that he wanted to write his own story, how he became an artist, which is interesting. Yeah.
I'll quickly note to plug your institution, Fabienne, that the Zentrum Paul Klee did produce this great podcast series a couple of years back on Klee's travels, and it's excerpts from his diaries and letters. So the listeners check that out sometime.
Yeah, it's a podcast, Mapping Klee, and it's in German, French, and English. So you can learn about his trips and how he was writing about his trips. Yeah.
So I also want to, you know, while we're plugging, I want to note that almost all of the Klee images we're looking at today are in the current exhibition at Werner. It's a really remarkable exhibition, very broad range of his work. And when you're looking at the captions, if you don't see another institution's name, if it's just like, you know, cemetery and date as it is here, it's because it's in the show at Werner. Really remarkable. The other thing I wanted to mention here, to underscore, and here's the, you know, undergraduate professor and me coming out, is the importance of this intersection that, you know, normally when you teach the history of abstract art, there's one story about how expressionism leads into abstraction via Kandinsky and Mark and the Blue Rider group. And then there's a completely different story about how you get to abstraction from Cézanne to Braque and Picasso and Cubism. And this is one of those rare moments when the two traditions intersect with this amazing effect. So we're looking at something really important. That said, Chloe, oh, sorry, Fabienne, carry on.
Yeah, I think Klee was really an artist who was as close to the French artist than to the German artist. So he was kind of making a bridge between these two, as you have said. Yeah.
So
it really sorry.
Speaking of things in the exhibition, if we could go, Chloe, to the next slide. Something I didn't realize until, Max, you told me, is that these two pictures, both in the exhibition, were originally part of the same picture. So could you say a bit about that? Because it kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So Klee, this is a practice actually that he did with some frequency. He originally, these two individual works, which he considered complete and finished works, were part of a larger composition, of which there are believed to be at least 7 pieces total, if not potentially more. These two are in our current show. A few are owned by private collectors. A few are, their whereabouts are unknown. The Art Institute of Chicago has one of the sections. But so he would compose a kind of larger narrative composition and then cut it down into these smaller pieces. And it's a kind of interesting part, it's interesting that he did this on several occasions. And from, what I've kind of read and from kind of looking at it myself, what seems to maybe be what drew Klee to do this was to focus more on the visual, formal, painterly elements of the composition versus a kind of overarching narrative. The grander composition that it was cut down from, there is a kind of narrative reading that one could make of it. And I think in some ways what Klee was wanting to do by taking, turning into these smaller works is to really have color, line, shape, form be the experience of the work.
Yeah, I think so too. I think he was not satisfied with the composition he had made because there was too many things happening in this whole composition, too much of a storytelling, and which he was not interested in. And I think that's why he cut this piece. I mean, there are other pieces also he was cutting and he was turning them around and, recomposing the same pieces, but in another way. So I think it was just when he was not, when he thought his composition was too boring or too dead, because he always wanted to have artworks that are lively, that have a life, that have a dynamic. Yeah.
And I'll just say too that Girl at the Window was right above Cemetery, like right above and to the right of it. So they directly connected to each other originally.
So it's as if she were looking down on the cemetery?
Yeah, I believe it's the original narrative. It's kind of looking out of a window or something down at the cemetery and some other parts of the original composition. Yeah.
Well, that must have been a moving thought in 1920, soon after the end of World War I, with the enormous loss of life.
Yeah,
very.
I think you're
reality.
Right. Yep. But you see him kind of, this is even just that act of kind of cutting or fragmenting a larger composition, almost a kind of collage play, that in and of itself has a kind of avant-gardist quality to it in that way. So he's exploring composition and trying to understand, he's still working through so many levels of his own practice. I mean, he has his whole life, right? He's constantly changing and adapting and incorporating new things. So that action of cutting up the original composition is itself a way of kind of engaging with his own avant-gardist principles and ideas.
Yeah. So one of the topics we were talking about in preparing for today was the question of Klee's relationship, on one hand, to Delaunay, whom we've just looked at, and on the other hand, to Piet Mondrian. If Chloe, you could take us to the next slide, please. So here we're going to step outside of the perimeter of the Zorner show for a moment and bring in Fabienne. You'd send me this wonderful picture that's at the Zentrum Paul Klee on the right, the pictorial architecture red, yellow, blue, which is one of a group of Klees that seem to have a relatively strict, not absolutely strict grid. And we were talking about the question of how is this or is this not related to these checkerboard pictures that Mondrian made back in 1919? So I'm curious to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it definitely relates to, because Klee was not the remote artist that he sometimes portrayed himself as. So he was very well aware what was happening around the world, and also the other artistic movements. And he never wrote anything about Piet Mondrian in a letter or his diary, so I don't know what he was thinking about Mondrian, but he was certainly aware of the Destyle movement. We'll talk about that later. But it's interesting because it's very typical for Klee that he was kind of transforming these movements in something of his own, which was also suited himself. And here you can see his grid is not made with a ruler. He's like tweaking with his eye by using some of the primary colors, but using a lot of different colors, which was for this dogmatic textile movement really unruly to do that. And at the Bauhaus, of course, textile was very prominent and often discussed because Van Doesburg was also trying to become a teacher there. And maybe I could read just a small part in his teaching. Klee was telling his students, because they said he was an expressionist and he was not dogmatic enough. So he was kind of saying, against. So he's kind of explaining to the students against the schematism attempting to implement unadorned rules in practice. Such misunderstandings lead to construction for its own sake. They haunt the minds of narrow-chested asthmatic who make rules instead of works, who have too little air in them to understand that rules should only provide the basis so that the work can flourish. And that's how Klee's work is flourishing on the rules.
I hope nobody ever told Mondrian that he said that. I don't think Mondrian would have appreciated that description.
Well, and Klee was not particularly critical of other artists, and I know welcomed, the kind of the diversity of artistic approaches that were present in some ways with the Bauhaus. But I believe, right, Fabienne, that in this instance, there was some pointed criticism of the style kind of approach. And and what just briefly, like what I also think is interesting and compelling about this comparison here, which pits Mondrian at his most radical, right, at the grid at its most deductive, each equally sized unit that reinforces the structure of the canvas that he made it on itself. Is that work, you see it and you kind of can take it all in some ways at once, and that notion of instantaneity or quick ability to kind of process what you're engaging with, the optical nature of that is something that was very central to this style. Whereas with Klee, I would say that it's a prolonged process when you're looking at a work like this, because of the ways that it's not regimented, because of the differences in the imprecision of the gridding that he does there, right? As Fabienne said, he didn't use a ruler, he didn't kind of do this strict geometric gridding. So again, it's a great example of him taking another stylistic convention, other stylistic idioms, and incorporating them into his own, personal and individualistic approach to art.
Well, let me pose a kind of thick-headed question about this, which is, if you're Paul Klee and you're not going to commit to the absolutely regular grid, which is such a symbol of modernity, why use it at all?
Well, to have irony, to make fun of them. It was his way. He was not fighting with them. He was kind of like, I don't care. But he wanted to make some comments on it without confronting them directly. That's very Swiss, maybe also, the diplomatic way.
Yeah, and I think that comes out too in some of
irony.
Yeah, and I think that comes out in some of the comparisons we have further on, but also just the grid is not, despite the efforts of some artists, right? The grid is not just one thing. And I think in some ways, in a potentially jabbing or critical manner, Klee is making that very apparent with his style of his use of the grid.
I mean, I don't think this is just critical or satirical. There's a bunch of these gridded pictures by Klee, and one is more beautiful than the next. They're incredibly lyrical. He discovers a kind of lyricism in the grid. Okay, well, we could go on and on with the grid, but we do have a lot of pictures to look at. So Chloe, maybe we could go to the next one. So this is a picture that really surprised me. I don't think I'd ever seen a Klee quite like this before. And I'm wondering, what's going on here? Well, why does the figure look this way? What's happening with this big open space, which is so unlike the grid we were just looking at?
Well, it's it's not unlike Klee to render the human form in a variety of ways, but kind of with these kind of these thin pencil like structures to them, like a body kind of structured as a series of symbols or you know, curls and lines. So the kind of stylistically, it's not particularly out of the ordinary for him, as far as I'm aware. But it does, and it does play into, I think, a long tradition he has, as I kind of said at the beginning, of, on the one hand, kind of caricature, kind of upending the, you know, traditional presentation of the human figure. Right, 1923. If you think about the post-World War I ethos in Europe, many artists are returning to the human body as this kind of intact form after, you know, the 1910s, when many artists were kind of experimenting with the fragmentation of the body on various different conceptual and formal levels. And so I think there's a way in which Klee is kind of engaging with those conversations still, right? This is a kind of mechanomorphic body, right? The arms are like cranes. The eye has this monocle-like, you know, device. It kind of looks like a device of some kind. And so in some ways that could be read as, you know, artists at the time responding to industrialization and Taylorism and the, you know, mechanized warfare itself, right? Of so many soldiers coming back from the war with missing limbs and things of that sort, right? And having prostheses applied. And we normally associate that type of response to like the Berlin Dadists or Francis Picabia, an artist kind of in that vein. But I do think that there's an element of that with Klee as well. But I'd be curious kind of what you think too, Fabienne. This is me just entirely speculating.
No, I totally agree. There are a number of works where Klee was portraying like machine, human-like figures. Of course, he was also very interested in marionettes and theater. And I mean, the triadic ballet was, he also knew about that. That was also, Schlemmer was also at the war, and he was injured when then he was doing this triadic ballet. So I think that was a whole zeitgeist at that time. I mean, Fritz Lang's Metropolis movie, there are a lot of references, and people were like nowadays. I think that's interesting. Now, 100 years later, we are kind of fascinated, but also a little bit afraid of what machines can take over the human, you know, what we used to do. So and Klee was totally into this discussion and was trying to comment on it in his artworks. Absolutely. And as you said, also the First World War soldiers with the prosthetics, which was also kind of a machine-man combination.
Fabienne, could you say a bit more about the triadic ballet? It's something that I think was well known to people of my generation, because Schlemmer used to get, you know, be very well featured at the Museum of Modern Art, less so today. But those big geometric figures dancing are quite remarkable. Maybe you could spell out a little more how that, you know, what it looked like and how it relates to the figure we're seeing here in Klee.
Yeah, so Oskar Schlemmer was designing a ballet, and you don't really see the human bodies. They are all, how do you say, they have costumes with geometric forms, the dancers. So you don't see the human body, which is also kind of a distance to, and the combination between this kind of geometrical forms that look like machines, part of machines, and they move also in a very robotic way. Yeah, and the music is also very abstract.
You know, it's funny because that's been revived recently by the Korean artist Hae Young, who's created sculptures that are modeled on Schlemmer's figures, and they turn around, they're set into motion, and they ring bells and so forth. So it's all coming back. Sorry, Max, I cut you off.
Oh no, I was just going to add on that, just in case people listening haven't seen representations of the triadic ballet. There's a great one from the 70s that is kind of the best known one, even though it's very different from what Schlemmer envisioned in a lot of ways. But I'm sure it's on YouTube if you Google it and are interested.
Great. So one narrative point that we've rushed past is that Klee started teaching at the Bauhaus in 1920, very early in the existence of the Bauhaus. Its founding director, Walter Gropius, invited Klee to come and be on the faculty as a form master. Gropius had this idea that there should be craft masters who were craftsmen, and there would be form masters who would teach principles of composition. So that's the role that Klee took up there in 1920. So we're into his Bauhaus period here. And Chloe, if we could go to the next image, please. So this is a sort of wild speculation, knowing that the picture on the right of Klee's landscape with Pleasure Garden was done in 1924, and that it gives us this overhead view. I couldn't help wondering if there's some kind of relationship to Gropius's overhead view, designing houses of the type that are similar to the master's houses at the Bauhaus. But is this just looking for connections that aren't there? What's happening here?
Well, I don't think that there is a direct relation to this Gropius drawing, but what Klee was interested in, and what you saw at that time in a lot of magazines, that with the airplanes, there were new photographs that could be taken. So he was totally fascinated by these photographs that were taken of landscapes from the airplanes, and was kind of transforming them. Some of them are also very abstract, because if when we take the plane and you see all this countryside with all the different fields, with the different colors, so that's something he really liked to transform in his own artworks. And here I think he's probably also referring to the pleasure garden that was in Weimar. There was a pleasure garden at the time, and Klee loves nature, so he liked to take walks through the pleasure garden and transform it in his own.
Well, pleasure garden sounds extremely exciting in English, but here it's something less sensational in German. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it's the Lustgarten called. So that was a very strictly organized landscape design, but where you could hide in all kind of different places, and I think which was an interesting place for young people.
The drive-in of its day.
Right, fantastic.
And I would just add to that as well that to me it really speaks to aerial photography exactly, which also was a great source of fascination for constructivists, Moholy-Nagy and others as well. And if anything, I think the kind of architectural diagramming or drawings or schematics, I think relate a little bit to like a work I think we'll look at in a minute, because right here there's none of that axonometric projection. There's none of that 3D rendering of 3D form on a 2D surface. And instead, in some ways, I think Pepe, your reference to like a bird's eye perspective of a more classical tradition in painting resonates with me, right? Because it's about, in some ways, bringing the world onto the surface here, providing a lot of information in some ways. Again, with Klee, I do think there's prolonged viewing that he invites through his various approaches to his work. And so here, right, the S-curve of the river and the garden itself, which is abstracted and almost has a biomorphic quality to it, the checkering of the mountains, right? You really linger on these things, even though this is a very modest size work. So to my mind, it does actually fit. I actually found that to be kind of captivating, the notion of it participating in that tradition of the bird's eye perspective of more classical Western painting.
Now that you've called out the sort of checkerboard on the mountains, I'm noticing there's also an arrow pointing down the bridge towards the bridge, across the bridge. And of course, those arrows are a very important element in a lot of Klee's work, not so well represented here, but there is one of them. Great. So let's go to the next, please, Chloe. And so this comparison is to address the question of Klee's relationship to another of his colleagues one of his colleagues at the Bauhaus, Vasily Kandinsky, who had also been invited to teach there. And, my theory or fantasy in putting these together was that the little boxes, the grid that gets to be a bunch of little boxes in the clay on the right, maybe is speaking to the kind of boxes, the use of the grid in Kandinsky's work of the 20s, which of course is completely absent from his better known work from before World War I, before the revolution. But let me turn to the experts here. What do you all think about this?
Well, I think that, yeah, I mean, this was a very important relationship for Klee, because Kandinsky was older than him. So he was already a well-accepted avant-garde artist when Klee got to know him in 1911. And he, as I said, introduced him to the whole art scene in Munich. So that was very important for him. They had a very close relationships. And then through the First World War, everything broke apart because Kandinsky was Russian, so he had to leave Germany. And then they met again at the Bauhaus, where Klee started to teach in 21, and Kandinsky joined 1 year later. And afterwards in Dessau, where the school moved in 26, they even shared a house. They had like two houses next to each other and lived there. And you can definitely see how they influenced each other. That's not a question. And I think they were friends, but also rivals in some way. So it was, I think it was a very good relationship they had.
Yeah, and I'll jump in too, just that, in thinking about the year that Klee is making his work, and I think you're absolutely right, Pepe, that the influence there is it's too close for Klee just to be like, this is, none of this has to do with Kandinsky. But also at the kind of later in the 20s, when constructivism really is kind of being pushed so assertively at the Bauhaus, especially once Walter Gropius leaves in 1928 and his successor comes, Hannes Meyer. Klee, there were a lot of conversations surrounding constructivism versus the so-called expressionists that were at the Bauhaus. And in Klee, again, he'll take things from other styles or other approaches to art making, even if they seem on the surface anathema to what his interests are. So I think, again, what's neat here is, or interesting here from a constructivist perspective, is that he's, again, not using a ruler. It's not kind of rigidly geometric. It's very much adapted to his own approach to it. And one thing with Kandinsky, Klee, when you do kind of read what Klee would say about Kandinsky, he's so complimentary and just so supportive of this, someone who really seemed a artistic personality and spiritual presence that was like-minded to Klee. They really connected on that level. He was also really supportive of Klee at a moment when Klee was still kind of figuring it out in 1911. He supported his work then and brought him into this broader, or expanded his artistic circle even more. He certainly had connections before Kandinsky, but expanded it even more. And so I sense at least that there's just a deep appreciation for both of them have for each other. But at Kandinsky's 60th birthday in 1926, Klee noted, and I have just a little quote here, that he said at an exhibition that was held on Kandinsky's 60th birthday. Klee said, "His age of development was above mine. I could have been his pupil, and to a certain degree was, because much of what he said was able to shed a soothing light on my own search and confirm it." And it's just such a generous sentiment as an artist, to really recognize someone who was so supportive and aided him in his own, progression as an artist.
Yes, that's lovely. So speaking of continuing with this theme of Klee's relationship to other artists, Chloe, if we could go to the next pair. Also during these years, Theo van Doesburg came to stay in Weimar and was not actually hired as a teacher at the Bauhaus, but gave courses nonetheless. And I wondered, looking at the drawing on the right with these this strange combination of black lines and perpendiculars on floating planes, which both do and do not suggest Van Doesburg. You know, what's going on here, or is this just a random resemblance?
Well, to my mind, it's pretty spot on. To me, and I know we already kind of touched upon this a little bit, it does seem like a pretty direct jab. It's a great work. I mean, it's really a really fantastic work, but an odd one. Like, where is this coming from? Indeed, and those strong kind of graphic lines do seem to be coming from, you know, informed by the style. But the fact that they're done in this dynamic composition that has a sense of projection and recession and even hints of illusionism seems to be, you know, mocking that form a little bit. I mean, it's both. It's appreciating it. It's finding something interesting and captivating on a formal and abstract level, but also kind of taking jabs at Van Doesburg's principles and the rigidity of those principles. And in fact, like the German title for this, the word hardness is Härten, which can have multiple meanings. And Fabienne, you know, feel free to correct me if I'm flundering on my German, but it could mean, you know, rigidities and not just kind of hardness, right? So rigidities in motion to me seems like, you know, Klee uses his titles for humor and to make points sometimes. And I think it could be kind of mocking the rigidity of the style.
Yeah, and it's even a strange word in German, Härten. It's not a word that I'm aware of. I mean, Klee invented some words sometimes, and he also mixed it with Swiss German, which is sometimes quite challenging for art historians. Yeah, but I totally agree. I think Klee was aware of the whole discussions. I mean, a lot of students, they loved Theo van Doesburg. They went to his private classes that he gave in Weimar, not at the Bauhaus. So the Bauhaus students went to the private classes of Theo van Doesburg, and they loved this dogmatic, clear, you know, how it has to be, which is of course easier than Klee, who said, like, you know, you have to find your own artistic language. I'm not going to tell you what you have to do. I'm just going to try to help you how you should approach your design or architecture.
Yeah, you know, it's funny thinking of different degrees of dogmatism. If Klee is making fun of Van Doesburg's dogmatism, Van Doesburg here is actually also challenging Mondrian's dogmatism, because Mondrian felt that only verticals and horizontals were permitted, that the diagonals were strictly not permitted because they suggested actual living life. And when Van Doesburg began making these pictures, Mondrian was so angry that he wouldn't talk to him for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. And what's also interesting, in 1928, Klee was publishing a small text in the Bauhaus magazine, in translated is like Exact Experiments in the Realm of Art. And there he explains, of course, we construct, that's very good, and we have to do that, but we also need intuition. So he was really like saying, it's okay what they are doing, that's okay, but it's not enough. If we want to do something really interesting, we need exact research, absolutely, but we also need the unknown X or intuition or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, and Van Doesburg took his jabs at Klee too. You know, like he was not a fan. And when Moholy-Nagy sent him a copy of Klee's pedagogical sketchbook, which Moholy-Nagy had done the cover design for, Van Doesburg was so dismissive of it. I mean, so, you know, wrote back kind of scathingly, just completely throwing out as having any value, essentially.
Wow. So we are running a little short on time, and we have a lot of material to cover. So I just want to briefly show the next slide, and then we'll move on from that. There's this beautiful drawing in the show called Further Study in 3 Dimensions, which seems like a bit of a return to the Cubist influence work of 1920, with these overlapping, not just flat, but three-dimensional form. But rather than dwelling on this, Chloe, if we could go on from here to the next one, please. There's a very different kind of drawing that emerges, or emerges in the exhibition around 1930, like this Path to the Knot, which made me think of the pedagogical sketchbook that you just mentioned that Klee had published in 1924 with these extraordinary studies of curves. Here's a basic S curve. Here are all the lines you could put around it. Here's the shading you could put around it. That book of Klee's is one of the great documents of modern art. But what do you think brought him back to this idea in 1930, and why specifically in the form of thinking about strings and knots and so forth?
Maybe it was because he was teaching the reading class at the Bauhaus. So he was teaching theory of how you can design compositions for weavings. Maybe that's why he was close to, textile, knots. And there is a very, very similar drawing by Annie Albers, which is really interesting. They were very close at a certain time.
Yeah. Annie at one point said Klee was my god.
Yeah.
And she was sometimes critical of his manner of teaching, but just took so much from him. And, so that relationship is, it just speaks to him as a teacher too, and that importance to him. And this work is just so fun and lyrical, and on the one hand it's essentially figurative, right? This thread that's twirled around other threads, but on the other hand very abstract. And Klee made similar works to it at the time. I mean, he was very prolific, so he's made a lot of works, and a handful of them are he takes these kind of string forms, jumbles them together, giving them little faces, and they're like tripping over each other. And they're really like very, very charming and funny, and just a reminder of Klee's kind of humor and how he could use his approach to line. And so, he could use line in so many different ways, right? Seriously, comically, geometrically.
And interesting is that the title is Passes to the Knot. So he was again showing like how is the process, how do knots become? So they seem very lively. You think in every moment they could change, and that's very typical for Klee too.
Really interested in this link to Annie Albers and the weaving workshop. In the early 1920s, Klee did a number, or at least a few, landscapes with horizontal bars of color over the sea. There's a view over the North Sea, and there's some very similar woven compositions by Albers, and maybe even more than that by Gunther Stölzel, who was also a kind of superstar of the weaving workshop. So I thought about Klee's influence on the weaving workshop in the early 20s, but I hadn't thought about it at all as late as 1930. And of course, this gets us into a microscopic level of looking how the threads are actually behaving rather than looking at the picture as a whole.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Great. Let's Chloe go on again. So the exhibition also includes these two remarkable drawings. I can't remember whether they're next to each other on the wall as they are here, but they struck me as being related in terms of these interlacing, overlapping forms that are curved rather than being primarily straight-edged. So at some level, this seems like a kind of reference to or acknowledgement of the movement of biomorphic surrealism, which had become important at the very end of the 1920s. But of course, one of these is absolutely flat, just the pure outline on the left, and then the one on the right, although you can't see it so clearly, at least not on my computer screen, is beautifully shaded. I mean, the quality of the shading here is extraordinary. It's like that 1903 etching of the Virgin in a tree. So just general question, how did Klee engage with this style? What was he thinking when he did this kind of drawing?
So in relation to biomorphic surrealism, I have to imagine that was influencing him, just as imagery of that kind of work was circulating at that time. I would say, undoubtedly. But the reference that comes through in these, and this is reinforced by the titles, are musical. Klee himself was an accomplished violinist, a lover of music his whole life, and he often found in the abstract nature of music a method for his art in a lot of ways. And so the titles lead us here a little bit, right? Dynamic polyphonic group, right? These overlapping, these kind of diaphanous, they actually have a kind of woven almost appearance to them. They're these diaphanous biomorphic forms of very subtle hatches, overlapping each other, but playing together in the same way that the polyphonic composition is played and harmonizes together. And then exotic harmony, this kind of beautiful composition that's done with the most economic of means, right? To my eye, at least, it appears that he put a grease crayon on the paper and just drew without kind of lifting it up. And maybe he did, but it looks as though it's completed in kind of just a series of movements without lifting the crayon from the paper. And he's able to make this kind of beautiful form where you start to interpret shapes and subjects. And it was, there were two kind of drawings like this, and then another drawing, which they were seemingly the studies for, that has kind of shaded in or colored in portions of the forms. But yeah, so I think that kind of music would be my inroad to thinking about these works. And just his ability to work with line in very different, but equally kind of stunning, beautiful ways.
Yeah, I think the left one is a very good example for taking a line for a walk.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
a famous quote that Klee never said, but it's a nice, it's nice. I like it. It's this point going for a walk, and then it becomes a line. Has something to do probably also with the écriture automatique that the surrealists also were using to find new forms from the unconscious. And on the right, as you have said, absolutely, polyphony was very important to him to get in an abstract way, a depth in his works with these layers to express this polyphony that he also liked in music. Yeah.
And I'll just mention one thing that's really evident in both these works, but especially the one on the left, is that Klee, he mounted the majority of his works himself, and he mounted them to these thin boards that he would then inscribe with his signature, the title, the date, and his own kind of numbering cataloging system. And he would make the adhesive himself from flour and water. And you can kind of see in the image here at the margin how it kind of bunches and there's kind of wrinkles and things, which was actually a fact that he liked. It kind of added texture and another element to the work. So that's an important component of it that often I think isn't thought about or addressed, but is, I would say, something in our exhibition, in our past exhibitions, that we really have enjoyed highlighting, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, let's go on again, Chloe, to the next, please. So here on the right is a drawing that I was really kind of knocked back by. I thought, wow, I would not have guessed this was a Klee. And, it made me think of this Magritte. There's a group of Magrittes from the late 20s with these big kind of blobs, connected by little channels. But that may be not a significant, just an accidental resemblance. But Fabienne, you told us some interesting stuff about this when we were talking about the other day. Can you come back to this, please?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite Klee works. I really love it. It's really strange. I also think it's very contemporary. It could be a contemporary artist who could have done that. These really strange organic forms. And the form in the middle, there is two letters on it, P-O, which means paw, which means ass in German. Paw, so you can see the form of a butt. And of course, these brown organic forms, you can think of your own what it's kind of he was relating to. So I think it's a very playful artwork, very typical for Klee's late work. Yeah.
Yeah. And
I mean, other ones.
No, go ahead, Beth.
Sorry, Max, go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to say kind of something that struck me about it, informed by the title in some ways, of which there is ambiguity in terms of the translation of Orden, are these silver forms, which do kind of seem like, you know, military decor or medals of some kind. In, you know, the context of 1938 with, you know, National Socialism, you know, at its kind of peak in so many ways. And that even affecting Swiss society. By this point, Klee had moved back to Bern, Switzerland, after he was removed from the Art Academy in Dusseldorf, where he had taught for 2 years between 1931 and 1933. Left after that, he's back in Switzerland. But the impact of this kind of remilitarization and the fervor for war and for the glory of those things is certainly evident, and he's experiencing it and witnessing it himself. And it was just funny, just seeing it made me think of like this well-known painting by the 19th century German realist painter Adolf Menzel of this ball, this like military ball, basically, or a Prussian kind of high society ball, and everyone's in their military uniform and regalia, and they all have these massive medals everywhere while they're trying to hold plates of food very awkwardly. And so in some ways I saw it as like a little bit of an ironic gesture at that, you know, that there's these fraternities and orders and brotherhoods everywhere, and they're giving themselves medals and symbols and, you know, all this kind of reactionary craziness at the time.
Right. Yeah. So since the clock is ticking towards when we should shift to the Q&A, let's sort of rush through a few more images here. Chloe, if we could just briefly look at the next one. There's this stunning and very surprising drawing in the show, a double screamer that made me think of Northwest Coast masks. But let's not pause on this. If we could keep going, please. Thank you. And then I was fascinated by this drawing on the right, which seems to fit into a group of drawings from the late 30s with these ideographic signs, black lines on yellow and brown grids and squares. But in this case, you can see those lines as contours from, you know, a very naturalistic representation of a billy goat. How typical is this? I mean, I was really surprised by it, but maybe it's more typical than I know.
I think it just became this more or less realistic goat while he was doing the artwork. I think he started with the black lines. And then he was adding the colors, and then at the end he thought like, oh wait, we could do a goat. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well. Yeah, and he did do kind of a few works like this at the time. But what I liked about it, and I think Pepe, you had also shown it against Van Doesburg, right. Were
Chloe, if we could click one forward, please.
So yeah, so exactly in this comparison, if we see Van Doesburg abstracting from the form of the cow, in some ways we see Klee, you know, figurating from abstraction,
yes,
so exactly. To speak, you know, so it's almost the reverse process going on there. So it's a great, this comparison's so good in that way.
Great. So let's go forward again. There's something I wanted to get to before we run out of time. So I wanted to talk about different philosophies of exhibition design. As I mentioned at the beginning, this Werner installation is very striking for its spareness. We'll come back to that in a moment, but just to lay out the contrast, I mean, I haven't yet been to the Zentrum Paul Klee, and if I could possibly add a few more days on to my summer trip, or take a detour from Venice to Bern to see this. It looks fantastic. But, you know, clearly this is a kind of multimedia display. You have the works of art, you have floating walls with photographs, there's a seating area with books and catalogs for people to consult. Chloe, if you could go to the next one. And conversely, the Werner exhibition installation rather is, you know, so pure, so classically modern. I mean, this is the style that comes out of the Vienna secession around 1900, this idea of white walls and just lining works up in a row. So Fabienne and then Max, if you could say a little bit about how did you decide on these installation philosophies?
Well, I think as the Centrum Paul Klee, our goal is to introduce the visitors to the work of Paul Klee and also to his life. We also want to, you know, that they get to know at least some of the artist, what he was thinking, how he was looking, with whom he was hanging out. So that's why we decided to have these large photographs.
Great.
So that
Chloe, if we could go back for just a moment. So
so that people kind of can encounter clay, you know, on the same level. And of course, you also want to show always parts of our archive. That's why you have these showcases, which is very important to show. For instance, in this showcase, you see Klee's books where he was writing all his works. He was numbering the title, to whom he sold it. It's also the first contract he had with an art dealer is there. But there are other showcases where we for instance, show how his music, his violin, his records collection. So we always try to keep it lively, the collection display. It's also always changing. Now with this, it's like the structure is staying for 5 years, but we changed the artworks, we changed the archival materials. We also make podcasts and movies that people can listen to in the exhibition, but of course also online. Yes. So, and with the colors for each decade, we have a different color. So it's also easier for the visitors to have an orientation where they are. So we want to make it as simple for the visitors to understand how Klee's work was evolving and his life.
Great, thank you. And if we could go forward again, Chloe, Max, maybe you could say a little bit about the aesthetic decisions involved here, the very spare installation, the spacing, the clean, narrow, dark frames, and so forth.
Yeah, you know, I think so. So for this exhibition and the two other Klee exhibitions that we've had starting in 2019, when we started working with various members of the Klee family, we're all kind of presented in this spare, elegant manner. And you know, on the one hand, we have a bit of a different mission than a museum. So we have the we don't, we want to be educational. We want it to be didactic and informational, but we also really want, the individual experience of the works to be very, first and foremost in the encounter there. So the three exhibitions were curated by a partner at the gallery, David Lieber. And, early on in conversations with the family as well, I think it was one of the things that appealed to them, this style of presentation that the gallery is pretty well known for. And so, in this type of, spacing the works out as we do here, I think it allows people to kind of take their time going through the works. We just have the title and year listed next to them in vinyl on the wall, because the titles really kind of add something to it as well. And then the presentation of the works, historically, many of these have been shown with passepartouts, with the matte window over them, and kind of honing down just on the support itself. And we found it really compelling to present the works without those, and to show the boards that Klee that he mounted his works on, which have a kind of compositional value. They're different size, so the borders are different in a lot of cases and relate then to the work that's in there, and how it's shown. He again used his own adhesive, so there's kind of texturing that goes on there. And then with the dark frame, which I think a lot, provides in some ways a good way of elevating the graphic marks, or the kind of color that he puts on the composition itself. And so even though the white cube kind of presentation, or white walled presentation has does extend back a century, I also think it's still very contemporary. And so in some ways, I think the goal is to recognize that Klee has a certain contemporaneity. And I think that's shown in the fact that we present this work, and then downstairs we have an artist, Lucas Arruda, who's making works currently, a young artist, shown in a similar style of presentation. It just speaks to Klee being actually deeply relevant today to artists and to viewers as well, I think.
Absolutely. So in fact, I think this is where we should shift to taking questions from the other participants. Chloe, you are the boss of questions, or who is the boss of questions?
I'm the boss of questions. And we have one question for now. If anybody else has a question, please feel free to post it in the chat, and I will pass you the mic when I'm able. The First question is about mediums. If you can talk a little bit about the different mediums that Paul Klee used, and to what impact and effect.
Well, 85% of his work is works on paper. So there are few paintings. He was experimenting with all kinds of mediums, which is not always easy. So for instance, he was gluing newspaper on burlap, and then he was painting on the newspaper, and he was experimenting with all kinds of different textiles. Yeah.
Yeah, during the war, when materials weren't readily available, he was stripping the canvas that lined World War I aircraft from it and using that as the supports. Colored paste that he would kind of make himself. All kind of variety of media. And then, as you say, Fabienne, I think it's because the museum so often will put forward the works on canvas, the panel paintings that he made. It's not as apparent that, yeah, the vast majority, I mean, overwhelming majority of the works that he made were on paper, and which he referred to as polychrome sheets. He had polychrome sheets, monochrome sheets, panel paintings, so he had his own kind of classifications for these things. But the works that actually we have up in the exhibition now are quite representative of the media and format that he worked in for much of his life.
Yeah, that's sometimes disappointing for visitors. They think they come and they see like all these huge paintings by Klee, which don't exist.
Right?
Yeah. So
yeah, like the largest one is or one of the largest is Ad Parnassum, right? In Zamban, which is a top 10 painting for me as far as I'm concerned of all in my favorites. And it's I don't know, like just it's not massive or
no.
Thank you both so much for those answers. I have a few more questions that have come in. So the next one is, when did the universal appeal of Klee's art begin to influence illustration and advertising design in the mainstream?
I think mostly in the 1950s.
Yeah.
You could see a lot of design, textile design, also prints, and also, I think it was in the 1950s when Klee was inspiring a lot of designers.
Yeah, and the interest in Klee in the U.S. really started to grow in the 1930s. He had a solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in
1930.
30, thank you.
Yes.
That I believe was like the first solo exhibition of a European artist that the museum held, and so early in its history. So I think in 30s and then in 40s and then especially in the 50s, I mean there were several kind of German and then later American dealers selling his art in the US, and it really started to gain a great deal of popularity after his death in 1940.
Yeah, he had
influencing everything.
He had like 3 art dealers in New York in the 1930s. They all left to Germany and went to New York and tried to sell his artworks, which was not so easy. But he was a very important artist also for the abstract expressionism generation, because they were all looking at these exhibitions. There were sometimes 2 or 3 Klee exhibitions at the same time in New York.
Yeah, and the gallery represents the Ed Reinhardt Foundation, and I remember seeing some early Reinhardt works from the 1940s and being like, oh, this is absolutely influenced by Klee. And there'd been all these exhibitions in New York at that time, so it just seems very apparent.
Thank you so much for those answers, and thank you for that question. The next question is going to be from Donald. Did Klee function as both modernist and critic simultaneously in his approach?
I think he was, Max, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think in some ways, as Fabienne and I both touched upon, I think so in some ways, just because, satire and caricature were actually very powerful forms of modern art in some ways in the 18th, 19th centuries, and he was kind of coming from that. And so I think that critical bite that you do see in his work sometimes, or even frequently, is definitely integral to his project in practice. Not every, it doesn't, not defining of him solely, but in my mind, yeah, I mean, critique and criticism is a powerful mode of operating in, the spaces of modern art. So yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, I think so too. He was really a modern artist, and at the same time, he was always critical of he knew what's happening around him, but he was also kind of critical or ironic, commenting on what was happening. He never was part of a movement, or people sometimes ask me, so what was he? Was he surrealist? Was he a Dadaist? Was he a Cubist? I'm like, no, he was none of it and all of it at the same time.
Great answers. Thank you so much. This is a good question to end on. It's from Stephanie. Can you speak about Paul Klee's psychic improvisation?
Oh, well, that's a great question in the context of how we're going to conclude. Exactly. I was going to read where that title that comes from. And so the title of the exhibition was it was actually hard. And the curator, David Lieber, was really struggling with the title because it wasn't as straightforward in some ways as the earlier shows we did, which focused on the later work. But he actually encountered this reference to psychic improvisation in a text really unrelated to Klee. And then I kind of tracked down where it came from and learned that it came from this 1908 diary passage that Klee wrote. And it was about his kind of revelation around line. So conveniently, I can kind of read that as my concluding gesture here. So again, this is from a diary passage from 1908. Line is such, a work of art goes beyond naturalism the instant the line enters in as an independent pictorial element, as in Van Gogh's drawings and paintings and in Enzor's graphics. In Enzor's graphic composition, the juxtaposition of the lines is noteworthy. In fact, I'm beginning to see a way to provide a place for my line. I am at last finding my way out of the dead end of ornamentation where I found myself one day in 1907. With new strength from my naturalistic etude, I may dare to enter my prime realm of psychic improvisation again, bound only very indirectly to an impression of nature. I may again dare to give form to what burdens the soul.
Wow.
Wow. Thank you, Max.
Yeah.
And Fabienne, I believe you have a reading as well to close us out.
Yes. As you know, Klee was teaching at the Bauhaus for 10 years, and he was never really writing a theory of art. He was really teaching and trying to explain to his students that the design or architecture or art is a process, and that the result is maybe not that important. So he was often using nature as an example to explain to them that forms have to grow as a plant is growing. And there is in one lecture in January 1924, he was explaining his Lehre vom Schöpferischen, which is his teaching of creation. And this sounds to me like a manifesto, and I would like to read it to you. So he told his students, the way to the form which shall be dictated by some inner or outer necessity stands above the goal, the end of that path. The path is essential and determines the character of the work that is hitherto to be concluded and will hitherto to be concluded. Formation defines form and hence stands above it. Therefore, form is never to be considered as a conclusion, as a result, or an end, but as genesis, as becoming, as being. Form as appearance, however, is an evil, dangerous phantom. Form as motion, as action is good, active form is good. Form as inertia, as the end, is bad. Passive, accomplished form is bad. Formation is good, form is bad. Form is the end, is death. Formation is movement, is action. Formation is life. These sentences concentrate the elemental doctrine of creativity, which is touched upon here in its very core. its significance is fundamental, and I believe that the above cannot be repeated often enough.
Wow.
Wow, Fabienne, that was lovely.
That
Thank
was.
you so much for closing us out with that reading. And thank you, Max, for your reading as well. That was such a beautiful way to close. And thank you, Pepe, for guiding this conversation today. You all, it was such a generous conversation, and it was lovely to take part in and be a part of. So thank you so, so much for being in the space with us today. Thank you as well, of course, to David, Aaron, and Julia at David Zwerner for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our New Social Environment program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, where you'll be able to watch this shortly on YouTube. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our staff, our operations, and our writers. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free next week, please join us for the last week of programming before the New Social Environment takes a summer break from June through August. On Monday, we'll screen Looking at Pictures on a Screen, Thomas Miskowski, directed by Gabriel Rodriguez-Fuller. And on Tuesday, we'll hear from Ming Smith, Daisy DeRosier, and Emmanuel Eduma on the occasion of multiple current and upcoming exhibitions of Smith's work in New York and Ohio, as well as several other events. And I hope to see you all very soon. I'm going to throw open the mics and allow everyone to say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Pepe.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Pepe.
Thank you very much.
Fabienne,
That was wonderful.
That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Everybody, go see the show.
Yeah, see the
Yeah.
show.
Yeah.
Open through June 15th.